I think that there are few, if any, people in the whole of literature and philosophy who have explored in such detail and with such a wealth of ingenuity and insight the mechanisms of self-deception, the ways in which people fool themselves. This is not something altogether new with Sartre, far from it. For example, if you read Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, you may find, to your surprise perhaps, that this is one of the themes that runs all through the book. To the best of my knowledge, it's not a point that has been widely noted or that has been made in print, but I think it is one of Tolstoy's central preoccupations too, to point out how people deceive themselves. It's interesting how often the word self-deception and deceived himself and did not want to know, phrases like that, how often they occur in Anna Karenina. So I'm not trying to say this is something altogether novel in Sartre. Obviously it isn't. But I think that if you consider that some other people tried their hand before it, and some very formidable and wonderful people like Tolstoy, it's doubly remarkable that Sartre should have come up with so much that is so good on this subject. And now by way of leading into morality from there, there's of course one person who explored self-deception a little earlier than Sartre, and that is Sigmund Freud. And Sartre devotes a section of his main work, Being and Nothingness, to what he calls existential psychoanalysis. He isn't, I think, in that quite as emphatic as he might be about making clear that Freud has some priority here, that Freud developed psychoanalysis, and that now Jean-Paul Sartre is trying to introduce some variations. At times it almost sounds as if it were a well-known fact that, of course, there are two kinds of psychoanalysis, Freudian and Sartrean. But there is one important difference which I think much less separates Sartre from Freud than it separates Sartre from many followers of Freud, and not only from followers of Freud, but quite especially from the large lay following that Freud enjoys, the people who have read some Freud and use him. How? Well, precisely to do what Sartre is most preoccupied with attacking, namely to deceive themselves about their freedom, to live in bad faith, to hide from themselves their freedom. I don't think that this amounts to a very fatal attack on Sigmund Freud himself. It's not a point that in this lecture I want to go into deeply. But I think that Sartre is clearly right that many people who have read Freud tend to say, as if it were obvious, well, this is the way I am, and of course it's all the fault of my governor, so all the fault of my father or my mother, the way I was brought up, and something happened to me when I was 2, and that accounts for the way I am. So this is a way, according to Sartre, of self-deception, of living in bad faith, of hiding your freedom from yourself. Here, Freud himself, who went out to attack self-deception, has been quickly made into another instrument and tool of self-deception. Now, what I've been saying amounts in a way to suggesting, and this on purpose, that Sartre's central inspiration is moral, that Sartre's central concern is in a way that of a moralist. For all that, it is a fact that his major work ends with a promise that he will, before long, give us an ethic, and he has not so far been able to give us an ethic that satisfies himself. He has not worked out a book on ethics. But for all that, I think in all of his work, deeply moral concerns are implicit. And so I shall now suggest what I think are Sartre's major insights about morality. Number one, he clearly denies that there is any absolute morality. He clearly denies that there are any moral facts, facts that are simply there for us to recognize and to conform to. Another way of putting this is to say that his view of morality is anti-platonic. Plato, in an important sense, believed, even if Socrates before him didn't, Plato believed that there were forms, ideas beyond this world of justice and temperance and courage and other virtues, also a form of the good, and that it was up to us to see these forms, to have a vision of them, and if we couldn't, and most of us can't, then to listen to people who have had such a vision. In other words, according to Plato, there are, as it were, moral facts which man should realize and then conform to in his life. Many religious people look at it similarly, that there are certain things that as a matter of fact are good and evil, and that man should recognize these and live accordingly. Sartre, on the other hand, denies absolute morality and suggests that morality is a matter of choice, not just a matter of choosing whether I want to be a good boy or a bad boy, but a matter of choosing moral codes, of choosing what I am to consider moral and immoral. I don't know whether this so far would strike, let us say, the majority of this particular audience as particularly radical. Very likely not. Very likely, so far, a very large percentage of modern intellectuals would not only go along, but even say, well, surely that's a commonplace. But Sartre goes further. He suggests further that there is no human nature. He says there is no human nature. Now, what does this mean? There are some people, notably including some of Freud's most famous followers who are critical of him, who have tried to develop a more or less absolute ethic, a humanistic ethic, by way of suggesting that there is a human nature, and that once you recognize what this human nature is, it becomes obvious that some things are good for it and other things are bad for it. You only have to be a doctor, that is the suggestion here, to realize that some things will ruin the patient and others will make him function properly. And this means that after all, everything isn't so bad, everything isn't so serious, everything isn't so critical. There are certain things that are good for all men and there are other things that are bad for all men. This is a very comforting view, and I dare say an extremely popular view. And very large numbers of educated intellectual people who agree that in the old Platonic or religious sense there are no absolute values, assume that in this sense you can somehow reinstate a universal and, up to a point, absolute morality. Sartre does not agree with this. He thinks that there's no human nature for which some things are good and some bad, but that, and I quote him again, man makes himself. That man decides what is good for him and what is bad for him, and that man has to choose here. And that if he kids himself into thinking that there are certain things that just plain are good for people, or that just plain are bad for people, Sartre would say he engages once again in his favorite game of self-deception. He once again lives in bad faith. Now it may of course be suggested, and is often suggested by the people who use the strategy that I have just outlined, that not only are there things that are good for all men and that are bad for all men, but that of course this isn't new at all, but that all the great religious teachers of mankind agree, that they have all taught the same things, that there is a significant moral agreement, and that in this way the latest science and the oldest religions agree. Is this view right, which is so popular, or is it possible that Sartre is more profound at this point? I would side with Sartre on this. I do not agree that human nature being what it is, certain kinds of behavior are bound to be disastrous and to bring unhappiness. Let's say, for example, murder, theft, polygamy, dishonesty. Well, on the other hand, altruism, monogamy, and honesty are the best policy. I don't agree with that in quite that way. And of course, this last way of putting it sounds cynical. Well, the people who put forward this view bend over backwards not to be cynical. They avoid all cynicism, and they appeal not only to anthropology, sociology, above all psychology, but they also make frequent and respectful bows to mankind's greatest moral teachers. And just as there is a ready-made audience for archaeologists who claim to prove that the Bible was right, there's also a ready-made audience for social scientists who prove the great religious teachers right. If one engages in that sort of thing, one can hardly fail, at least as far as popularity goes. But there are a number of things that are wrong with it. The first one is that the great religious teachers of mankind did not agree about morality. I won't go into any very great detail about that in this lecture. There will be opportunity if some of you want to challenge me about this in the discussion to engage further in argument about this. I'll just point out that even the people who claim that the great religious teachers of mankind agree are forced very soon to say that, of course, some of the so-called great religious teachers were not really great, that some of them were very bad. We somehow have to separate out here the good religious teachers and the bad religious teachers, at which point this particular appeal, so far as I can see, breaks down completely. In that case, we might say some religious teachers agree, but others don't agree, and if the only way we have of finding out which ones are right is not by looking to them, but by examining the facts, then the appeal to authority crumbles. But when that does crumble, then I think the second fault of this strategy, which alone is crucial, meets the eye. And that is that science can present facts, but it does not establish any standards. It might conceivably show us what makes people happy and what does not. It might tell us what conditions favor a great burst of poetic creativity and what don't. What conditions make for excellence in sculpture, for great architecture, and what conditions don't. What conditions make for impressive music and what conditions don't. Always assuming here, of course, that we can agree on what is great music, great architecture, great sculpture, and so forth, which is a moot point. One might also possibly expect that scientists can tell us what social arrangements or what kind of behavior has promoted major scientific breakthroughs. But what science cannot tell us is what goals we should choose, whether we should choose happiness or scientific breakthroughs or excellence in sculpture or in poetry or in music. Now, what of course is immensely popular is to tell people that they can have everything and heaven too. There's no need to make any choices at all. A maximum of pleasure and of science and of art and of philosophy and of music, of morality, of comfort, of high standard of living, of religion, liberty, poetry, can all be had if we will only learn the art of loving. Or to put... There's a biblical formulation of it: seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Or in modernese, become mature, and all these things shall be yours as well. But to my mind, this is really a view that is the quintessence of immaturity, besides being thoroughly unscientific. One sees here the world in black and white. On the one side, there's Jesus, justice, joy, love, truth, Freud, and all the good guys. And on the other side, you get guile, gloom, guilt, tyrants, totalitarians.